A few weeks ago, I was having coffee with a friend who works in tech, and the conversation turned to the latest news. And he leaned in, his voice dropping to this conspiratorial whisper. "Something's shifted," he said, tapping his phone screen. "Look at this." He showed me headlines about eased chip restrictions and a new U.S. strategy that barely mentioned human rights. He had this triumphant glint in his eye. "It's happening," he insisted. "They're backing down. The pressure is working. We finally got them on the ropes." His certainty was just absolute. To him, each headline was a clear, undeniable trophy in a grand contest of wills, proof that one trajectory was irrevocably bending to another. It was a narrative of checkmate, played out in diplomatic cables and export licenses. But then I asked him about the Russian bombers, the ones that flew alongside Chinese fighters right up to Japan's doorstep just the other day. That triumphant glint flickered, just for a second, and it was replaced by a flicker of something else: dismissal, annoyance. He just waved a hand. That's just a show of force, a separate issue. And the clean, satisfying narrative of America being pushed into a corner suddenly had to share space with a far more complex and far more dangerous game of military brinkmanship in the skies of Asia. That jarring disconnect between the story of competitors softening its stance and the reality of escalating coordinated power projections, that really stuck with me. It begged a question. If one side is truly being backed into a corner, why does the chessboard keep getting bigger? And why are new, even more powerful pieces suddenly entering the game? Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we are tackling that exact question. The common narrative about U.S.-China competition, it often focuses on a single dimension, economic containment through technology. But the information we've gathered shows two competing, almost contradictory forces at work. On one hand, you have what we're calling the economic squeeze, the U.S. tightening controls on cutting-edge semiconductors, and it is successfully creating friction for China's high-tech ambitions. But on the other hand, there's the strategic response. China is pivoting toward technological self-sufficiency, while at the same time capitalizing on a new, highly transactional U.S. foreign policy. And that's leading to a potential loss of influence for Washington in really vital regions like Southeast Asia.
We really need to unpack this duality, because the traditional idea that economics and security are, separate domains is completely obsolete in this contest. We are in a world where economics is security. Our mission today is to figure out how effective the U.S. small yard, high fence approach really is in practice, and what the unintended strategic costs are of defining this conflict purely as an economic one when Beijing is playing a multidimensional game. What does it look like when economics is security in the real world? And, well, what happens if one side just completely underestimates that strategic interplay?
Okay, let's start with that semiconductor chokehold first. The starting point for the U.S. strategy here is a concept that, on the surface, sounds very contained, very reasonable. This small yard, high fence. What exactly does that phrase encapsulate when we're talking about these export controls on China?
Well, this strategy, which was heavily popularized by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, is essentially a very sophisticated tool for what you'd call strategic denial. The fundamental objective is to protect U.S. national security interests. Specifically, it's about preventing China from achieving technological parity in key military enabling fields, while, and this is the key part, attempting to minimize the disruption to the broader, non-critical global economy. The small yard defines the scope. It's not about a full economic decoupling. It's more of a surgical restriction targeting the most advanced technologies. Things like cutting-edge AI chips, high-performance computing, and the unique tools you need for advanced chip manufacturing.
And the high fence is where the teeth come in, I assume.
Exactly. The high fence represents the rigorous, almost absolute export controls placed around that small, critical technological domain. This isn't just about refusing to sell the finished chips. It's about controlling the choke points in the supply chain. We're talking specialized software, proprietary designs, and most crucially, the fabrication equipment itself. As of late 2024, the U.S. had significantly expanded its enforcement, targeting about 140 Chinese companies with these really stringent restrictions.
And the ultimate goal is to hobble China's military civil fusion program, right? Forcing them to spend huge sums of money just trying to catch up where Western firms already dominate.
That is the core strategic rationale. Military civil fusion is Beijing's formal policy to leverage civilian research, civilian technology, and commercial infrastructure for military advancement. So by cutting off access to the newest generations of civilian tech, particularly high-speed processors and advanced manufacturing tools, the U.S. aims to ensure that China's military can't benefit from the latest innovations in AI or hypersonic weapons or advanced surveillance. The restricted tech includes critical equipment like tools for etching, deposition, and of course the most famous one, lithography, the machines that are essential for patterning advanced chip circuitry. If China can't get those tools, its technological capacity just hits a hard ceiling.
Okay, so the strategy is surgical denial at the most advanced level.
Right.
So let's talk about the immediate economic impact. You'd expect the squeeze to be felt in China, obviously, but these restrictions must also demand huge adjustments from global firms, too.
Oh, they absolutely do. The compliance costs are enormous, and the market disruption is palpable. U.S. companies like Lam Research and Applied Materials.
The big equipment makers.
Exactly. And international giants like Samsung and SK Hynix, who make the memory chips, they've all had to dramatically restructure their sales operations and their R&D pipelines to make sure they aren't violating the specific performance thresholds defined by the controls. And this often means designing customized, sort of downgraded products specifically for the Chinese market, which is expensive and really complex.
And for the Chinese firms that are caught inside the fence, like Wingtech Technology or Nora Technology Group, what does that immediate impact look like for them?
For them, it means a severe constriction of supply. It forces them to scramble for older, less efficient, or indigenous alternatives. And this creates immediate headwinds. The overall data paints a really stark picture of the squeeze. Since the first major restrictions were put in place in 2022, China's imports of semiconductor manufacturing equipment have dropped by more than 32.5% overall.
32%. And I imagine that's not evenly distributed.
Not at all. If you look at the major tech hubs, Guangdong province, Shanghai, and Jiangsu province, the import drop was even steeper. It fell by a massive 43.7%.
Wow, 43.7% in the industrial heartland. That's not just a statistic. That has to have serious ripple effects across their whole economy.
It translates into real-world pain. The domestic auto sector, especially the surging electric vehicle market in China, relies so heavily on abundant, reliable, and cheap chips for everything from infotainment to battery management. With a constrained supply, these manufacturers face high delays and increasing costs. And it's the same for the consumer electronics sector, which drives huge amounts of employment. Prices rise, supply chains become volatile.
And this chaos doesn't just stay in China.
Right. No, the volatility underscores how deeply integrated these supply chains really are. Europe, for example, is experiencing increasing manufacturing costs and supply chain delays, particularly in their automotive and electronics sectors, as they adjust to the reduced availability and higher cost of chips globally because of this distortion in the Chinese market.
Okay, this all paints a picture of intense, pretty successful strategic containment. But here's the inherent contradiction that gets to the bifurcated chessboard we opened with. Despite tightening the fence, the U.S. maintained these licensing processes that led to some pretty controversial commercially driven deals.
That's where the policy tension becomes really visible. The goal is strategic denial, sure, but the commercial interests of powerful U.S. tech firms are still significant. And these firms argue that completely abandoning the Chinese market harms their own R&D budgets, which, ultimately benefits U.S. technological leadership. So in 2025, the Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS, which manages these controls, approved licenses for NVIDIA's H20 and AMD's MI308 GPUs for sale in China. And these chips are explicitly modified to fall just below the designated performance thresholds. It's a very sophisticated workaround.
But the controversy wasn't just about the sale itself. It was the specific condition attached to those licenses.
Precisely. Under the terms of the license, the U.S. government would receive a 15% share of the proceeds from these licensed chip sales. And this condition immediately ignited a political firestorm among policymakers and security experts.
Wait, hold on. 15% of the revenue from the sale of advanced AI hardware is going back to the U.S. government. If the goal is strategic denial of critical technology, how did BIS even begin to justify essentially negotiating a cut of the proceeds? Doesn't that completely undermine the security narrative?
Well, that is the core criticism. BIS argued that the revenue share provided two advantages. First, it created a financial disincentive for companies to push the absolute limits of the control thresholds, subtly guiding them toward less powerful chips. And second, it provided a source of funding that could be earmarked for monitoring and enforcement of the controls themselves. But critics just saw this as crossing a critical line. It looks like you're negotiating national security decisions for government revenue or trade concessions. It fundamentally contradicts the traditional U.S. stance of rejecting any Chinese attempt to link commercial access with strategic security decisions.
So if the U.S. previously insisted that national security was non-negotiable, that it was outside the realm of trade concessions, taking a 15% cut makes it look like the government is now actively commercializing that security decision. That raises some really serious questions about how coherent the policy actually is.
It absolutely does. It suggests that economic interest, even in the form of government revenue, may be getting prioritized alongside or even above strategic denial. And we have to look closely at the chips themselves. The H20 is a tailored version of NVIDIA's flagship H100. It's optimized for memory bandwidth, which is crucial for AI inference that's, running AI models. But crucially, the core count is reduced to fall below the export control thresholds. So NVIDIA and AMD are engaging in this incredibly complex engineering to sell chips that are just powerful enough to maintain their market position and support Chinese AI development, yet just weak enough to comply with U.S. rules.
The high-stakes game of inches.
It is a high-stakes game driven by both commercial pressures and government constraints. And that 15% fee makes the entire policy appear profoundly compromised.
So if the U.S. strategy, even with its loopholes, is working, it should be driving China to respond drastically. And we are seeing overwhelming evidence that Beijing now views the U.S. as a completely unreliable economic partner and is accelerating its push for domestic self-sufficiency. Let's delve into that indigenous innovation drive. It seems to be encapsulated in this extremely ambitious Tachyon Plan.
The Tachyon Plan is Beijing's comprehensive, multi-year strategic response to containment. They've recognized the vulnerability of relying on Western IP and equipment, so the state has poured massive, coordinated investments into local semiconductor knowledge and manufacturing. And unlike previous efforts, which relied heavily on the big fund, the National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, the Tachyon Plan is directly overseen by the highest levels of central planning.
Okay, so why the shift? Why move away from the big fund to this new structure?
The big fund was often criticized for, poor governance, corruption, and scattering resources across too many different projects. It wasn't focused enough. The Tachyon Plan represents a major centralization and targeting of those resources. The central government, specifically the NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission, has given the tech conglomerate Huawei the mandate to lead these broader innovation efforts. This gives Huawei unparalleled state backing and the resources to integrate research across multiple state-owned companies and local governments, really focusing efforts on specific technological choke points.
And Huawei's chip design arm, HiSilicon, is clearly at the strategic heart of this. What's their most ambitious move to ensure long-term freedom from U.S. export restrictions?
Their long-term strategic move is to fundamentally eliminate their reliance on Western intellectual property, specifically ARM architecture. They're shifting toward the open-source RISC-V architecture.
Why is that so important?
Because they currently hold an ARM v9 license, which is a legacy vulnerability, a huge one. By committing to RISC-V-based semiconductors, they aim to create designs that are entirely insulated from any future U.S. licensing restrictions or export controls. This is a massive generational undertaking. It means retraining engineers, rewriting huge amounts of design IP, but it's what they see as necessary to guarantee hard sovereignty over their chip designs.
I'm fascinated by the technical desperation they're showing in manufacturing. The U.S. and its allies control the advanced extreme ultraviolet, or EUV, lithography tools. That forces China to push their existing deep ultraviolet DUV tools far beyond their conventional limits. What techniques are they researching with partners like Compensating?
This is where you see some real technological ingenuity driven by pure necessity. DUV machines were never designed for the cutting edge, but China is cooperating with SEMIC and SICK to research these highly complex multi-step lithography techniques like quadruple patterning or SAQP.
Quadruple patterning, what does that even mean in practice?
Think of DUV as a fine pen, and they need to write something incredibly tiny. Quadruple patterning is like using that fine pen, letting the ink dry, then drawing the next layer with perfect alignment, and then repeating that process 4 times. It's an attempt to multiply the pattern density and push DUV closer to achieving something like a 3-nanometer class node.
Wait, 3 nanometer? The industry consensus suggests DUV usually maxes out around 7 millimeter, maybe 5 millimeter, at an absolute push. Isn't that timeline wildly aspirational given the technical hurdles?
That is the critical skeptical lens we have to apply here. The R&D is intensive and state-backed for sure, but industry experts are highly skeptical about the commercial viability and, crucially, the yield rates for 3nm via SAQP.
Yield being the number of good chips you get per wafer.
Exactly. When you require 4 perfect deposition and etching steps, the probability of failure just increases exponentially with each step. You end up with dramatically higher scrap rates, which makes the chip prohibitively expensive. Plus, these multi-patterning techniques increase manufacturing complexity, they raise energy consumption significantly, and they slow down throughput. So, while they might be able to demonstrate a 3nm class chip in a lab, achieving the necessary high-volume manufacturing scale for something like a smartphone by 2027 is still considered a monumental, maybe even impossible, technological leap without true EUV access.
That really puts the timeline in perspective. They've got a massive R&D commitment, but the economic efficiency is still a huge question mark. Beyond the bleeding edge of logic chips, what about progress in memory? That's equally vital.
They are definitely making headway there. Memory is another key choke point, and the success of Yangtze Memory Technologies, or YMTC, is a major marker. They provided the NAND flash memory used in the Huawei Pura 70 smartphone. And this is significant because it represents a successful domestic substitution for a critical component. They're moving past their reliance on stockpiled or foreign memory that they used in many previous domestic flagships. It shows that, at least in certain memory segments, the indigenous effort is reaching commercial viability.
This brings us squarely to the AI side of the competition. The U.S. controls are aimed at slowing down AI development by restricting GPUs, but China is trying to compensate for hardware weakness through, well, sheer scale and central planning. Let's discuss this GPU competition and their national compute strategy.
Right. Advanced GPUs, graphics processing units, are the lifeblood of modern AI training. China has several contenders, including Huawei's Ascend series, which uses their Malian GPU, and then startups like Biren, More Threads, and Inflame. They are producing respectable hardware, but the core difficulty is not the chip itself.
It's the software ecosystem, isn't it? That's the immense hurdle.
It's the single biggest barrier. The global AI ecosystem is completely entrenched around NVIDIA's proprietary CUD platform. Every major AI scientist, every software library, every training framework is optimized for CDD. So cultivating a robust software development environment for a Huawei's Ascend chips, creating what they call their MindSpore platform, is incredibly difficult. They face a massive challenge in hiring and training enough software engineers quickly enough to match the decades of investment NVIDIA has put into its developer community. The time lag is measured in years, maybe even decades.
So how does the government try to compensate for this fundamental software and hardware gap?
Through central planning and sheer industrial scale. It's a classic move of non-market economies. The National Compute Power Network, or NUCPN, is this massive government-backed mega project overseen by the NDRC. It's designed to pool computing resources nationwide, essentially creating a vast, centrally managed electrical grid for data processing. This is China applying its state-driven industrial policy to the silicon shortage.
What are the concrete targets for this network?
The goal is astonishing: to reach 300 exaflops by 2025.
And just for context,
that's double the capacity they had in mid-2022. And importantly, they are mandating that 35% of that capacity must be based on domestic GPUs. The strategy is clear. If they can't have the single most powerful chip in the world, they will ensure they have the greatest quantity of pooled computing resources in the world. This scale attempts to brute force AI training, allowing researchers to train large, sophisticated models, even if the underlying hardware is less efficient than the restricted US-made counterparts.
That is a very potent public signal about their self-sufficiency goal, especially when you pair it with visible success stories.
Absolutely. We saw a powerful demonstration in September 2024 when China Telecom claimed they had trained a 1 trillion parameter large language model, an LLM, using only domestically produced semiconductors. That success, likely leveraging Huawei Ascend and Kunpeng components across the NUCPN structure, sends a message globally. Containment will not stop our strategic objectives. It will merely accelerate our path to independence.
So the U.S. is trying to contain China economically, but at the same time, China is deploying its own economic countermeasures and leveraging geopolitics. What does that counter-retaliation look like in the materials sphere?
China's immediate counter-retaliation often targets materials where they have market dominance. In mid-2023, for instance, they restricted licenses for exports of gallium, germanium, and other critical rare earth metals. These are essential for certain semiconductor manufacturing processes and military technologies. They also restrict market access for targeted foreign companies like the memory maker Micron, which signals a clear intent to use their massive domestic market as a geopolitical weapon to foster their own self-sufficiency.
And if Beijing knows this technological fight is a decade-long marathon, where are they finding the strategic support to keep the lights on and secure resources in the short term?
They're finding it through building alliances that deliberately exclude the West. And this raises a really important question about the efficacy of U.S. policy in isolation. China leverages its leadership in BRICS prioritizing cooperation, finance, and joint research to establish non-Western technological supply chains. They're also deepening ties with Russia, which is facing similarly stringent technological penalties because of the Ukraine invasion. This collaboration isn't just theoretical. It includes shared R&D, resource sharing, and moves toward establishing common standards for semiconductor ecosystems that are intentionally designed to operate without any reliance on American involvement. The technological rivalry is fundamentally driving the formation of these alternative, non-Western economic and technological spheres, which diminishes the global reach of U.S. standards.
We've established that the economic squeeze on China is driving innovation and new alliances in the tech sphere. But now we need to shift to the second, contradictory force at work. The strategic erosion that's resulting from a new U.S. foreign policy approach that is alienating key partners. The core identity of this U.S. approach seems to be defined by a new national security strategy, or NSS. What are the pillars of this new NSS paradigm, specifically when it comes to competition with China?
The new U.S. National Security Strategy, which was issued in late 2025, represents a fundamental and frankly profound shift in American grand strategy. It's built upon two doctrines the strategy calls civilizational realism and hard sovereignty. This represents a severe break from the post-Cold War consensus that saw the U.S. leading the world through alliance networks, promoting democratic values, and establishing a stable global trade order.
So it's actively rejecting the ideology of global democratic leadership.
Explicitly. Under this NSS, the competition with China is defined primarily as economic, not ideological. It champions economic nationalism as the primary component of national security. Civilizational realism views the world as inherently competitive and zero-sum, where the pursuit of domestic prosperity is the highest foreign policy priority, often at the expense of allies. And hard sovereignty means rejecting supranational obligations, drastically reducing multilateral engagement, and focusing almost entirely on domestic economic protection. The emphasis on promoting democratic values and human rights takes a real back seat to securing transactional economic wins.
And this NSS codified the highly aggressive trade posture that has really defined this new era.
It did. The cornerstone policy is a universal baseline tariff of 10% on all imports regardless of origin. And that's coupled with higher punitive tariffs specifically targeting countries that maintain large trade surpluses with the U.S. The message is simple. The U.S. will engage with partners, but that engagement is now purely transactional, based on what economic concessions can be extracted, rather than on shared strategic values or long-standing security commitments.
Okay, let's look at the real-world impact of this shift, particularly the tariffs introduced in April 2025, which were dubbed the Liberation Day tariffs. Who are the immediate and maybe surprising victims of this new economic nationalism?
The tariffs hit Southeast Asia particularly hard, a region that was already struggling to balance its economic dependence on China with its security reliance on the U.S. The tariffs were determined by trade imbalances, leading to punitive measures against key developing economies that depend heavily on exporting goods to the U.S. And the figures are just shocking. Cambodia faced a 49% tariff, Laos 48%, and Myanmar 44%.
A near 50% tariff on nations like Cambodia and Laos. What is the strategic calculation there? These aren't exactly the primary global economic competitors.
They are not. The strategic calculation is driven entirely by the trade surplus metric, regardless of the relative scale of the economy. These massive tariffs just cripple their ability to compete and immediately destabilize their internal economic models. Even Singapore, which is a vital security and economic partner, it hosts the largest U.S. naval presence in Southeast Asia, was affected because it has a trade surplus with the U.S. The policy prioritizes a rigid economic formula over decades of security cooperation.
I can only imagine the response from Washington's allies and partners in the region.
The reaction was swift, and it was negative. Leaders at the ASEAN summit openly expressed deep concern over unilateral tariff measures. Singapore's prime minister was explicit. He warned that these tariffs fundamentally undermine the very multilateral global order the U.S. itself spent 80 years building. The economic damage is immediate, but the strategic erosion, the risk of pushing these vulnerable economies directly toward Beijing, is the greater long-term cost.
And compounding the damage from the tariffs was the abrupt withdrawal of foreign aid, which further signaled American disengagement.
That is such a critical detail, as it highlights the policy's callousness in the eyes of regional partners. Abrupt and sweeping cuts were made to long-standing foreign aid programs, including humanitarian assistance, essential health programs, and, most visibly, demining projects. This creates a message of American callousness, sacrificing soft power and humanitarian concern for immediate budgetary cuts.
And this action immediately creates a vacuum for China to fill, which makes the U.S. look even more unpredictable.
Exactly. Take the demining example. China immediately stepped in to fund a Cambodian mine-clearing project that the U.S. had just withdrawn support from. This allows Beijing to portray itself as the reliable humanitarian partner, directly contrasting with Washington's abrupt transactional behavior. Furthermore, the broader Washington recalibration away from long-standing European allies and multilateral bodies just amplified anxieties in Asia. Regional governments began to question the long-term reliability of U.S. security commitments when economic relations were being weaponized so openly.
This strategic doubt leads directly to a decline in U.S. credibility and a profound shift in regional perception, especially because Washington seems to have missed the memo that in Southeast Asia, economics and security are two sides of the same coin.
That is the crucial strategic blunder. The famous comment by the U.S. Secretary of Defense that he was happily in the business of tanks, not trade, was immediately rendered obsolete by the reality on the ground in Southeast Asia, where economics is security. For nations in this region, economic prosperity and stability are necessary preconditions for political stability. So if trade relations with a security partner are damaged, that partner's commitment is instantly questioned. The U.S. tried to separate the two, and the region is judging the resulting vacuum.
So if the U.S. is seen as prioritizing extraction over mutual investment, how has the region's perception of America fundamentally shifted?
The shift is corrosive to U.S. influence. A former defense minister from Singapore observed that the regional view of the U.S. had shifted from a necessary liberator that guaranteed stability to a chaotic disruptor due to policy shifts, and most worryingly, to a landlord seeking rent.
A landlord seeking rent.
That analogy suggests the U.S. is no longer seen as a strategic partner sharing a common destiny, but as a power merely extracting financial concessions for temporary access or protection.
We also have to acknowledge that regional instability, specifically the fallout from the Gaza crisis, further eroded U.S. standing in key parts of Asia.
That crisis deeply complicated the strategic landscape, especially in Muslim-majority countries like Malaysia and Indonesia. U.S. policy decisions created significant disillusionment. The 2024 elite surveys showed a steep decline in support for the U.S. in these nations. And while the 2025 survey showed a slight, narrow rebound for the U.S. at 52%, that data was critically gathered before the major 2025 tariffs and aid cuts were announced.
So that minor rebound was likely erased.
Exactly. The subsequent economic, strategic, and reputational fallout likely erased that minor rebound, leaving U.S. influence in a really fragile state at the very moment Beijing is increasing its outreach.
This friction takes us directly to Southeast Asia, a critical strategic battleground. For decades, these states successfully managed this delicate balancing act known as hedging, relying on the U.S. for strategic security while maximizing economic benefits from China.
And that long-held strategy of not choosing sides is becoming fundamentally untenable. The sources clearly indicate that the U.S. transactional approach and global economic pressures like supply chain diversification, friendshoring, are intertwining security and economics so thoroughly that the separation required for hedging is just collapsing.
And the U.S. policy is actually accelerating this strategic collapse.
It is, paradoxically. When Washington signals a willingness to openly condition long-standing security guarantees on trade performance, in effect, demanding economic concessions in exchange for military support, it destroys the core premise of trust that underpin the hedging strategy. If security guarantees are transactional, they are unreliable. And this drives the region toward China, not out of ideological affinity, but out of a pragmatic need to align with a more reliable long-term economic partner.
Let's contrast that with China's strategy, which seems to be winning the economic influence game through sustained long-term engagement and tangible infrastructure projects.
Oh, China is overwhelmingly perceived as the reliable economic powerhouse. They surpassed the U.S. to become ASEAN's largest trading partner way back in 2009. By 2025, a stunning 56% of regional elite survey respondents identified China as the most influential economic power.
And the U.S.?
A mere 15%. This perception is built on policy contrast. China actively positions itself as a strong supporter of the multilateral trading system, concluding RCP and even applying to join the high-standard CPTPP, while the U.S. is imposing blanket tariffs.
And the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, whatever its controversies and debt risks, it delivers visible, tangible infrastructure that immediately boosts domestic economies.
The tangible delivery is key to their influence, and it remains largely unmatched by the U.S. Consider the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail, known as Whoosh, which began commercial operations. It's a visible symbol of Chinese delivery. Or the Botan-Vientiane Railway, which doesn't just improve transport, it fundamentally transforms Laos from a landlocked country into a land-linked trade hub, creating new domestic economic possibilities. These projects translate China's economic pull into immediate, visible domestic political capital for the leaders there.
And speaking of visibility, China maximized the diplomatic damage inflicted by the U.S. tariffs.
It was a masterstroke of timing and coordination. Immediately after the U.S. Liberation Day tariffs, President Xi Jinping launched a high-profile diplomatic tour, visiting Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia. In under a week, he announced 113 agreements across these countries, ranging from trade deals to infrastructure financing. This diplomatic blitz reinforced China's image as the reliable, engaging economic partner, directly countering the disruptive and transactional image the U.S. had just created.
Now we have to get to the absolute paradox of this region, the South China Sea. China's aggressive behavior in that area is the top geopolitical concern, yet Beijing somehow manages to minimize the diplomatic fallout from it. How can the region prioritize economic quietude over fundamental security concerns?
The aggression is undeniable, and it's high on the list of concerns. In 2025 elite surveys, 52% cited China's aggressive behavior, the militarization of islands, incursions, physical clashes with partners like the Philippines as their top geopolitical concern. Logically, this fear should drive them firmly into the arms of the U.S. security umbrella.
But the economic incentives and diplomatic outreach just prove strong enough to override this strategic alarm.
They frequently are, through a highly pragmatic strategic calculus employed by Beijing. China is remarkably effective at minimizing diplomatic fallout through highly focused economic incentives. For example, despite repeated incursions into their exclusive economic zone, Indonesia continues close engagement. In 2024, they agreed to resume joint military drills and issued a joint statement that even included language aligning with China's position on Taiwan. Similarly, Malaysia maintains highly pragmatic, non-confrontational ties, consistently downplaying disagreements over the sea. This is likely due to both countries being major recipients of Chinese investment and financing. China successfully leverages economic dependence to secure geopolitical silence or quietude.
The ultimate risk for the U.S., then, is that this pressure forces Southeast Asian states to choose, and Washington might not like the answer.
Absolutely. Forcing a choice runs counter to the region's historical preference for non-alignment. When faced with this hypothetical choice, a 2024 survey showed that a majority of respondents, 50.5%, favored alignment with China, a result that was deeply alarming in Washington. And while the 2025 survey showed that slight marginal rebound for the U.S. at 52%, as we noted, that data was gathered before the major economic damage from the 2025 tariffs and aid cuts, the U.S. transactional approach risks driving these critical partners closer to Beijing purely out of economic and reliability necessity.
So how are these states responding to the mounting pressure to choose, if not by outright choosing China? What are they doing?
They're seeking maximum flexibility and diversification outside the U.S.-led framework. They're showing greater openness to non-ASEAN-led Indo-Pacific multilaterals, like working with the Quad on non-traditional security issues like maritime domain awareness and disaster relief without necessarily becoming formal members. And crucially, in 2025, both Malaysia and Indonesia joined BRICS.
Which is a huge move.
A huge move. But it was not an explicit ideological alignment against the U.S. or the West. It was a pragmatic move motivated by a desire to expand their economic options, secure development finance, and address major infrastructure gaps. It is a clear signal that when the U.S. becomes unpredictable and punitive, the region will actively seek alternative global frameworks.
Okay, let's unpack this and bring it all back to the paradox we started with. The competition is no longer a single chess match. The U.S. is playing a game of economic checkmate using semiconductor controls, and, well, in that narrow technological sphere, they're succeeding in limiting China's access to the most advanced chips. But the rules of the strategic game have changed, and the U.S. is simultaneously sacrificing the very pieces, the alliances, and the soft power that are necessary to win on the larger geopolitical board.
That is the precise diagnosis of the dual strategy cost. The export controls fulfill the strategic goal of limiting China's immediate technical objective, but they also accelerate China's technological self-sufficiency and drive it toward alternative anti-Western alliances like BRICS and Russia, creating a robust non-Western tech sphere. Meanwhile, the tariffs and the overly transactional foreign policy alienate key partners in Southeast Asia. These countries are questioning the long-term reliability of the U.S. security umbrella and increasingly view the U.S. as a disruptive partner only seeking rent. So the U.S. is winning a narrow technological battle over advanced chips, but it's potentially losing the broader essential strategic contest for influence and partnership that is required for effective long-term containment. The great strategic analyst Lee Kuan Yew once warned that Asia is not a movie America can pause and return to later, with its ability to shape the region's strategic trajectory unchanged. The current policy risks creating a strategic vacuum of credibility and reliability that Beijing is actively poised to fill through sustained long-term economic engagement, making the U.S.'s eventual return to credible leadership exponentially more difficult.